11 unanswered calls. That is what it costs to lose everything you thought you were. While Declan Walsh was pouring a second glass of Malbec for the woman who was not his wife, his 7-year-old daughter was lying on the kitchen floor of their Oakville home. Her lips turning blue, her small chest barely moving. He had told his wife he was working late. He had told her the Brennan Group merger couldn't wait. He had turned his phone to silent, set it face down on the marble nightstand of room 318 at the Hazelton Hotel in Yorkville, and he had smiled at the woman across from him like a man with nothing to lose. He had no idea how right he was. This is the story of what happens when the wrong man underestimates the right father. The evening had started the way most Thursday evenings did for Faye Walsh. She put Poppy to bed at 7:30, read her 2 chapters of the book about the red fox, who couldn't find her family, kissed her forehead and went downstairs to eat leftovers standing over the kitchen sink. Because sitting alone at the dining table felt too much like a reminder of something she couldn't name yet. Faye was 31. She had a degree in landscape architecture from the University of Guelph that she'd put aside to raise Poppy, a part-time job at a garden center in Burlington she loved quietly, and a husband who had been slowly disappearing for 2 years in a way she'd been trying very hard not to see. Declan Walsh was 36, a commercial real estate developer with a firm jaw, and the kind of confident posture that filled a room before he opened his mouth. When they had met at a friend's cottage on Georgian Bay 9 years ago, he had made her feel like the most interesting person at the party. Now she wasn't sure he remembered what she ordered at their usual restaurant. She was rinsing her fork when she heard the sound from upstairs. A dull thump, then silence. Then Poppy's voice, thin and wrong. "Mummy." Faye was up the stairs before she understood she was moving. Poppy was on the floor beside her bed, her small body curled on its side. Her face was wrong. Gray in a way that faces shouldn't be. Her breathing was a shallow, broken wheeze, like air being pushed through a paper straw. Faye had seen an allergic reaction once before, 2 years ago, a mild one, hives along Poppy's arms after a birthday cake with hidden almond flour. The EpiPen had been prescribed after that. It lived in the kitchen drawer beside the utility bills. Faye grabbed her daughter. She ran. She called Declan from the hallway. Voicemail. She called again from the top of the stairs. Voicemail. She called from the car, one hand pressing Poppy gently against the back seat, the other hand white-knuckled on the wheel. The phone rang 6, 7, 8 times before she stopped counting and started talking out loud to her daughter instead. Telling her to breathe, telling her she was right there, telling her to hold on. "Baby, we're almost there, hold on." Joseph Blenheim answered on the first ring. That was the kind of man Faye's father was. 71 years old, a retired inspector with the Ontario Provincial Police, and a man who had spent 40 years learning that when a phone rings at night you do not make it wait. "Faye, what's wrong?" Not a question. An assessment. "Poppy." Reaction. "I'm on the QEW heading to Oakville Trafalgar." Declan isn't answering. "Dad, she's not. She's barely." "I'm already moving," Joseph said. "Drive, I'll be there." He drove from his house in Burlington in 11 minutes. He later told Faye he had made it in the time it took to get his jacket and his car keys. She believed him. At the hospital, Poppy was taken from Faye's arms by a team that moved like a single organism, fast and practiced and terrifyingly calm. Faye stood in the corridor outside the trauma bay with her arms empty and her phone in her hand, dialing Declan for the 9th time. The call connected to voicemail after 2 rings. He had seen it. He had pressed decline. Joseph arrived in the waiting room while the doctors were still working. He sat beside his daughter, his large hand over hers, and he did not say anything because he understood that there were moments when words were simply the wrong shape for the space they needed to fill. Poppy's throat was swollen nearly shut. The anaphylaxis had been triggered by a fragment of walnut in a granola bar. She'd climbed out of bed to get from the shelf in her room. A new brand Faye hadn't checked carefully enough yet. She blamed herself for 3 weeks before she stopped, because her father reminded her, gently and only once, that blame required intent, and Faye had none. Dr. Arsenault came out at 9:47. She was careful and direct the way good doctors are. Poppy had been stabilized. The next 2 hours were critical. The epinephrine had worked, but there had been a period, roughly 4 minutes, when her oxygen levels had dropped to a point that warranted monitoring for neurological impact. Faye heard the phrase 4 minutes and felt the floor tilt. "Where's your husband, doctor?" Arsenault asked, looking at Faye's left hand, where the ring still was. Faye looked at her phone, 9:47 p.m., 11 missed calls on her end, 0 attempts on his. "I don't know," she said. It was the first honest thing she had said about Declan in months. Joseph stood up slowly from the chair. He put his hand on Faye's shoulder. "Go sit with Poppy," he said. "I'll stay out here in case the doctors need someone." He did not go to the nurse's station. He walked to the far end of the corridor, past the vending machines, and he stood by the window looking out at the hospital parking lot below. He called a number he had not used in 2 years. A man named Roy Thibodeau who had worked financial crimes for the OPP before retiring to a small private consulting practice in Hamilton. Roy, Joseph said, I need something looked at, quietly. Start with a man named Declan Walsh. Commercial real estate, Oakville. Tonight if you can. He hung up. He walked back to the waiting room. He bought a coffee from the machine that he didn't drink. He sat down and he waited. Declan arrived at the hospital at 11:15 p.m. He had parked, straightened his collar, and entered through the main doors with the practiced concern of a man who had been rehearsing the drive over. His eyes were clear. Not red, not frantic, not the eyes of a man who had spent the last 2 hours in agony at an unanswered phone. He smelled faintly of red wine and something floral. Not perfume exactly, more like a hotel room. Faye was sitting beside Poppy's bed when he appeared in the doorway. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. My phone died, he said. The charging cable in my desk is broken and I didn't realize until… She's stable, Faye said. She almost wasn't, but she is, thank God. He moved toward the bed. Faye stood up not to block him, but the movement made him pause. Faye, don't, she said quietly. She didn't say it with anger. That was what made it so final. From the corridor, Joseph watched through the small window in the door. He didn't go in. He looked at his son-in-law for a long moment, the way he used to look at a suspect's face during an interview, cataloging what was there and what was not there. What was not there was fear. What was not there was the specific kind of devastation a parent feels when they learn, after the fact, how close they came to losing a child. Joseph had seen parents who got the call late. He had delivered that call himself, more than once, in his years on the force. He knew what it looked like when a person received news that nearly stopped their heart. That was not what was on Declan Walsh's face. What was on Declan Walsh's face was relief. Not the raw, gasping, flooding relief of a man who almost lost his daughter. The smooth, composed relief of a man who had just survived a close call of a different kind altogether. Joseph walked to the end of the corridor and called Roy Thibodeau again. Start tonight, he said. The days that followed were quiet on the surface and volcanic underneath. Poppy recovered completely. There was no neurological damage, a fact that the doctors delivered with visible satisfaction, and that Faye received on her knees in the hospital chapel at 6 in the morning, alone, her hands in her lap, not praying exactly, just present in a way she hadn't been in a long time. Declan played the remorseful husband with precision. He brought flowers to the hospital. He arranged for a meal delivery service for 2 weeks. He held Faye's hand at the follow-up appointment and asked the allergist good questions in the careful voice of an attentive father. He told the story of his dead phone battery to anyone who asked, and most people accepted it because most people give grief the benefit of the doubt. Faye accepted it too, or she appeared to. She was good at appearing to accept things. She had been practicing for 2 years. What she didn't tell Declan was that her father had started coming by the house more often. Just for coffee, he said. He brought butter tarts from the bakery on Lakeshore that Faye had liked since she was small. He sat at the kitchen table and talked about the garden and Poppy's school and the hockey season with the easy warmth of a retired man with time on his hands. But Faye noticed that her father always seemed to arrive when Declan was home, and that he always watched Declan the way he had once, years ago, described watching a witness on a stand. Not hostile, not obvious, just very, very still. 3 weeks after the hospital, Faye came downstairs early on a Saturday morning and found Declan in his home office. The door was not fully closed. She heard his voice, low and deliberate, the particular quietness of someone who does not want to be overheard. I just need a bit more time, Remy. It's complicated. The situation at home? I know. I'm trying to manage it. Faye stood in the hallway, in her socks. She listened to her husband's voice say the name Remy the way a person says a name they have said many times before, and she understood something she had been trying not to understand for a long time. She went back upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed. She called her father. I think I already knew, she said. I just needed to hear it out loud. I know, Joseph said. I'm sorry. How long? Roy is still working on the full picture, but the hotel records go back at least 18 months. Faye closed her eyes. Poppy was asleep in the next room. Outside the window, the maple in the backyard was going red at the edges, the way it did every October. What do we do? She asked. Joseph was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a particular quality she recognized from childhood. The voice he used when he had already decided something, but was waiting for the right moment to say it. Declan is going to think he can manage this, Joseph said. He's going to try to control the timeline. He'll want to ease you into a separation on his terms, when his finances are protected and the assets are where he wants them. He has a partner review at his firm in 6 weeks. It was announced internally this month. Roy found it. He's up for partner? Senior partner. It comes with an equity stake in the firm. Once that's vested, it's significantly harder to include in a matrimonial division of assets. Faye sat very still. He's waiting me out. He's been waiting you out. Neither of them spoke for a moment. I don't want to blow things up, Faye said. I don't want a scene. I don't want Poppy too. You won't, Joseph said. You're not going to do anything. Just let him think the water is calm. I'll take care of the rest. The only thing I need from you is time. How much time? 6 weeks, Joseph said. He hung up. He sat in his kitchen in Burlington, the butter tarts from the bakery on the counter, and he opened the file Roy Thibodeau had sent him. Roy was thorough. That was why Joseph had trusted him for 30 years. The file had the hotel records, 18 months of Thursday, and the occasional Saturday at the Hazelton in Yorkville. A woman named Remy Colburn, 29, an associate at a competing firm who had met Declan at a conference in Ottawa. A joint credit card Declan had opened in a secondary name, used for restaurants. Weekends. A bracelet from a jewelry store on Bloor Street that had never appeared in the Walsh household. There was something else. Something Roy had flagged in the second document. Declan had been billing client entertainment expenses to the firm for meetings that had never taken place. Joseph read through the records carefully, the way he used to read case files, methodically, without hurrying past anything. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look at. The dinners billed to the Brennan Group account, the entertaining expenses on the Hartfield file, the mileage reimbursements for site visits to properties that Roy confirmed were never visited. It wasn't enormous money in isolation. It was meticulous, careful, and it had been going on for 3 years. Joseph thought about his granddaughter, lying on a hospital floor while her father was in a hotel room, 40 minutes away, with the phone face down. He picked up the phone and called a man he had known since 1998, a man named Alec Drummond, who had gone from the OPP to a partnership in one of the larger commercial law firms in Toronto, specializing in employment and corporate fraud. Alec, he said, I have something I need you to look at. It involves a colleague of yours, actually. A man named Declan Walsh. There was a brief pause on the line, then Alec said, Walsh, he's not a colleague, Joseph. He's not at our firm, but I know the firm he's at, and I know the name of his managing partner. Good, Joseph said. I'd like to talk to that managing partner before Declan's review. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in late November, Declan Walsh arrived at the offices of Ryerson & Cole in downtown Toronto for what he believed was his senior partner review. He had dressed carefully. A charcoal Tom Ford suit he'd bought in the spring. A pocket square. His good watch. He had a speech prepared, loose but confident, the kind of presentation you made when you already knew the outcome was in your favor. The boardroom was on the 22nd floor, floor-to-ceiling glass looking out over Lake Ontario in the gray November light. It was a beautiful room. Declan had sat in it before many times, always on the right side of the table. He walked in and stopped. The table was not configured for a review. It was configured for a meeting. 6 people were seated, his managing partner, Gordon Meyer, at the head. The firm's general counsel. 2 men Declan didn't recognize, one in a suit and one in what was clearly a government ID lanyard that he had not turned over yet. And, at the far end of the table, a man with a cane made of pale ash wood and the stillest face Declan had ever seen on a person who was not sleeping. Joseph Blenheim did not stand when Declan entered. He did not greet him. He simply looked at him with the focused absence of expression of a man who has spent a career making people understand, without a single word, that the room belonged to him now. Declan, Gordon Meyer said. Please sit down. Declan looked at the 2 strangers. He looked at the general counsel, a woman named Adele Park who had always been pleasant to him in the hallways. She was not being pleasant now. What's going on? Declan asked. This is not your partnership review, Meyer said. We've postponed that indefinitely. What this is a conversation about some billing discrepancies that our internal auditors identified last week. Billing? Declan started. 3 years of fraudulent expense claims, Adele Park said. She had a folder in front of her. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Client entertainment billed to accounts for meetings that didn't take place. Mileage reimbursements for visits that didn't happen. In total, slightly under $90,000. The room was completely silent. Declan looked around the table. He found no ally. The man with the government lanyard was from the Canada Revenue Agency's enforcement unit. Roy Thibodeau had told Joseph, which was the cleanest way to initiate a formal audit without involving local police in the first instance. I want a lawyer, Declan said. That's your right, Park said. The meeting will pause until your counsel arrives. However, I want to make something clear before we do that. She looked at him steadily. The firm has already made a decision about your employment. independent of any outside proceedings. That decision will not change regardless of what your lawyer says. Declan's jaw tightened. He looked at Joseph for the first time. You did this. Joseph looked back at him. His voice was very calm. You did this, Declan. About 18 months ago, when you decided that a hotel room was worth more than a phone call. My phone was dead. I've said, room 318, Joseph said. Thursday, October the 3rd, Hazelton Hotel, Yorkville. Check-in at 6:45 p.m. Check-out at 11:08. The cell tower nearest the hotel received a manual shutdown signal from your number at 9:49 p.m. He tilted his head slightly. That's 2 minutes after Faye called you for the 10th time. 2 minutes after Poppy's oxygen saturation dropped to 71%. Something shifted in Declan's face. Not guilt. Joseph had long ago stopped expecting guilt from men like this. What shifted was the realization that the story he had been telling was no longer the one being told about him. You're not just losing your job today, Joseph said quietly. I want you to understand what you're losing. You're losing the story you've been managing. You're losing the version of events where you were the hard-working husband who was tragically unreachable. The CRA will have your accounts frozen by end of week. Adele's firm has already filed the documentation with the Law Society, and by the time Faye's solicitor is finished with the matrimonial asset disclosure, the equity you were planning to protect in this partnership will be very clearly on the table. He paused. The room felt smaller than it had when they walked in. Go get your lawyer, Joseph said. You're going to need one. Declan was walked out by the firm's security at 11:22 a.m. Not in handcuffs, not yet, but by two large and expressionless men in dark blazers who had been briefed on the situation and understood their role. The live stream had not been arranged, because Joseph was not a man who needed an audience. He had done this for 40 years without applause, and he did not require it now. Declan stood on King Street in the November cold, in his good suit and his pocket square and his good watch, and he understood, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that the careful architecture of his existence had been designed on someone else's land. Remy Colborne had watched the morning unfold from her office 7 blocks north on Bay Street. She had not been informed of the meeting in advance. She received a call at 9 a.m. from her own managing partner, asking her to come in early. By the time Declan was being walked out of Ryerson and Cole, Remy was sitting in her firm's HR office learning that an anonymous disclosure had reached their professional standards committee regarding a conflict of interest involving confidential client information shared across competing firms. The disclosure included receipts, timestamps, and 2 years of hotel records that her firm's legal team found particularly illuminating. She was placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. The bracelet from Bloor Street, which Declan had charged to his firm expense account under the category of client appreciation, was itemized in the disclosure as Exhibit C. She did not cry. She sat very still in the HR office and understood that the life she had been building on someone else's debt had just come due. The divorce proceedings began in January. They were not simple, but they were complete. Faye had retained a family law solicitor in Mississauga, a woman named Kathleen Doust, who did not raise her voice and did not need to. Declan's assets had been frozen pending the CRA audit, which made the matrimonial negotiations less complicated than they might otherwise have been. He contested the valuation of 3 investment properties. He lost. He attempted, through his lawyer, to argue that the hotel stays and secondary credit card were unrelated to any matrimonial breach under Ontario law. His lawyer, to her credit, argued this point without visible conviction. He did not attempt to contest custody. Whether this was strategic or the first genuinely decent thing Declan had done in 2 years, was a question Faye had decided not to spend energy on. Poppy started swimming lessons in February. She was not particularly fast, but she was fearless in the water, which her coach said was often more useful. She asked about her father infrequently, and with the matter-of-fact curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to be wounded by an absence that was always a little there. Faye answered her honestly and age-appropriately, and some nights that was the hardest thing she had ever done, and other nights it was almost ordinary. Joseph came for dinner on Sundays. He brought butter tarts and he sat in the kitchen and helped Poppy with her reading and talked to Faye about the garden she was planning for the spring. He did not talk about Declan unless Faye brought him up, which she did less and less. One evening in March, Faye asked her father why he had called Roy Thibodeau that night at the hospital instead of going directly to the police. Joseph was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. Because angry men go to the police, he said finally, and I wasn't angry, you weren't? He looked at her. I was terrified. I drove to that hospital, and I sat in that waiting room and I thought about the 4 minutes the doctors mentioned. and I understood that there was a version of that night that ended entirely differently. He set the cup down. Anger would have made me move too fast. Anger would have given him something to defend against. I didn't want to give him a fight, I wanted to give him a fall. Faye looked at her father for a long moment. Outside, the yard was still brown from winter, but there were things beginning under the surface that she could feel even if she couldn't see them yet. "How long did you know?" she asked. "Before you called Roy." "The night at the hospital," Joseph said, when he walked in and his eyes were wrong. "I've interviewed people for 40 years, Faye. I know the face a person makes when they learn they almost lost someone." He didn't make that face. He paused. He made the face of a man who almost got caught. Faye nodded slowly. She didn't cry. She had done most of her crying in the winter, quietly, on the nights Poppy was asleep and the house was very still, and she had discovered that grief has its own timetable and cannot be rushed or reasoned with, only survived. "He's going to be okay, isn't he?" she said. "Eventually. He'll find another job or something like it." "Probably," Joseph agreed. "That used to feel like an injustice," she said. "It doesn't so much anymore." Joseph looked at his daughter. He thought about what it had cost her to arrive at that sentence, the particular currency of it, how much time and silence and ordinary courage had gone into the exchange. "No," he said, "the real loss isn't what we took from him. The real loss is that he had everything worth having, and he didn't know it. He'll spend the rest of his life in rooms where nothing is quite as good as what he threw away, and he'll never fully understand why." Faye was quiet for a moment. Then she got up and went to the back door and looked out at the yard. In April she put in a garden along the south fence, perennials, mostly, the kind that come back without being asked. She planted a Japanese maple in the corner, a small one, because the woman at the nursery said it would take years to reach its full size, and Faye had decided she was interested in things that took time. Poppy helped. She got dirt on her jacket and found a worm she named Gerald, and asked 17 questions about photosynthesis in a row. Joseph sat on the back steps drinking tea and watching his granddaughter crouch over the soil with the focused delight of a child who has no idea how close she came to not being here, and is simply, completely, here. Faye pressed her hands into the earth. It was cold and dark and full of everything it would eventually become. She thought about the night in October, about the 11 calls, about sitting in the hospital corridor with her arms empty. She thought about the 4 minutes. She thought about how a life can pivot on the space between what someone chooses to answer and what they choose to let ring. She did not think about Declan much anymore, and when she did, it was the way you think about a storm that has passed. Not with hatred, not with grief, just with the quiet awareness that it had happened, that it had changed the shape of things, and that the ground it left behind was still yours to plant in. The maple she put in the corner of the yard was small enough to carry in both arms. By the time it was tall enough to give real shade, Poppy would be 17. Faye intended to be there for every year of it, and so would Joseph, or as many years as any of us are given, which is never as many as we think and always exactly what we make of them.